Welcome to Deep Work Out Loud, the thinking that fuels our life, our work, and our leadership. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. This is the podcast where I sit with another professional coach and we do some work around a single concept, a piece of inspiration, something we've been thinking about, a topic that's been coming up in our coaching. If we're really lucky while we're talking about it, we might demonstrate a minute or two of what coaching might look like and feel like. But as I've said before, this is all an experiment and we'll see how it goes. With any luck, you will leave with something that you can apply and use in your work, in your life, or both. And today I'm here with Ron Pratt. Ron is the founder of the Altera Collective, a boutique coaching practice that helps high-achieving professionals navigate pivotal career transitions and realign their work with who they truly are. After building a successful career across consulting, finance, and executive leadership, including roles at BCG and Capital One, Ron realized that external achievement does not always translate to internal fulfillment. Isn't that the truth? Today, he coaches ambitious, values-driven professionals who feel quietly misaligned in their careers and want to move toward work that feels meaningful, sustainable, and true to their identity. His coaching approach blends depth, strategy, and grounded clarity. He helps clients reconnect to themselves, diagnose what has been getting in the way, and take aligned action with confidence and integrity. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we dig in, tell me what your journey to coaching was.
Yeah, it depends on how much time you have, but
I have all the time in the world.
fair enough. So my journey to coaching was a bit of a windy path. I think it all started back in undergrad. So I was initially going to be an elementary education major, and for different reasons, I ended up not going that path. Mostly, concerns about financial security.
Yeah.
It was a conversation I had with my dad that actually kind of spooked me about it. And so from there, I ended up switching to psychology, and I wanted to be a child therapist. And I ended up taking the research sequence, did not like it at all. And so ended up switching to majors again, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do at that point in time. And so I was kind of debating a little bit around, hey, what do I want to do? What might be the next best major? And I happened to go home, for the summer one year, and I came across a friend who recommended the book Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Mm-hmm.
I read that book and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, financial independence, that sounds good. He talks a lot about real estate in the book, and real estate was something I'd always been interested in. And so I was like, yeah, maybe I'll go do that. And so went back to school, declared a major in finance and economics, and ended up going that route. And so when I graduated from undergrad, I actually went the real estate private equity route. And so I worked for a couple of real estate private equity firms doing investment analysis and property acquisitions, portfolio management, et cetera. I did that in Seattle as well as out in New York and Boston. And, I think what ended up happening, or I guess the first point where I started to feel like, hey, maybe this is not the right thing for me, is when I was out in Boston and I was kind of working, and I was like, man, something about it just didn't feel right. I was like, I've worked really hard to get here and this is what I wanted. But now that I'm here, like I don't, something's missing. I don't really enjoy this like I thought I would. And so that sent me down a path of really starting to explore and really look at, okay, well, if this isn't it, what is that I want to do? And so I wasn't really sure how to answer that question. And so I just started taking a bunch of personality tests. And so I took, Myers-Briggs, and I took the DISC, and I took the map, and there's a bunch of them. I can't even recall the different assessments that I took. But through that process, a few things started to become clear. And one was that I really enjoyed big picture strategic work, and I enjoyed relationship management, and I really are building authentic relationships, and I really enjoyed kind of the service component to my work. And so I was like, okay, this is good insight, but I'm not sure what to do about this. Around that time, my grandmother who raised me came down. She got sick, and so I decided to move back to Seattle from Boston to be closer to home. And so while I was back here in Seattle, I was still kind of debating what I wanted to do, and I started really researching what careers could allow me to do the things that I knew I was interested in at that point. And I kind of came up with two paths. One was HR, and then one was strategy consulting. And so I wasn't sure which one I wanted, but I felt like either way I needed to go get an MBA to make that pivot, because I had been in real estate my whole career and felt a bit pigeonholed at that point. And so I ended up going to get my MBA. I went to the University of Michigan, and then coming out of Michigan, I ended up going the consulting route, just because I was a bit nervous about being pigeonholed again after being pigeonholed in real estate. And so I did that for a couple of years. I moved to Washington, D.C. after grad school, worked at BCG for a couple of years, gained a lot of skills, met a lot of really great people. But that familiar feeling started to come back around like, hey, this isn't quite it either. Something about this just doesn't fit me. And so, I ended up trying to figure out what was causing that. And at the time, I just still didn't have a great answer, but I knew that BCG just probably wasn't going to be the right fit for me long term. And so I decided to leave consulting and I went to Capital One. And at Capital One, I started in a similar strategy role, but then I met somebody that was at McKinsey previously, and he was starting an internal group where they were taking the folks with strategy or analytical backgrounds and giving them some training and some exposure to HR. And since that was the other career path that I was interested in, I decided to give that a shot. And so I did an internal rotational, kind of like leadership rotational program for about a year and a half. And then on the back end of that, I ended up exiting that program into talent acquisition. And so I led recruiting for one of Capital One's lines of business for a couple of years. And that was a lot closer to, I think, something, work that felt fulfilling, but it was still missing a bit of a piece. Like the work was no longer centered on profits for me. It was kind of more centered around people, which was, I think, a big piece for me. But what was still missing was the direct one-to-one kind of developmental work. I mean, there was a developmental piece in terms of managing my teams, but it wasn't to the degree that I wanted, and it wasn't the focal point of my work. And so over time in that role, that I think I ultimately realized that was the thing that was missing. And so, coaching had come up over the years, therapy, going back to school to become a therapist had popped up a few times in my head, but the coaching piece felt at this point in my career like it was something that was a bit more feasible. Like I had enough experience to do it and I saw a clear pathway to moving into that space. And so I ended up leaving Capital One at the end of 2023 and I joined Hudson's coach certification program, which is where we met.
Yeah.
And then earlier this year, I launched my own coaching practice. And, I guess about 9 months in at this point. And yeah, I feel like it was absolutely the right call. And I think, that alignment that I had been looking for this entire time, I finally have found that, and I'm in a role, in a career path that just feels like it's right. So.
Beautiful. I'm curious, going back to the beginning of that, initially, why were you drawn to elementary education?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think it was just natural wiring. I think a few of the things that I know for me, like, so my grandmother, she played a really, really big role in my life, and she was a nurse, but she was very like empathetic and really about human development. And so I think that was something that she really instilled in me. And so I think part of it was natural wiring, but I think also part of it was just her influence on me. And so wanting to give back, wanting to, being fascinated and wanting to be involved with human development was something I think that has been a core theme in my life for a long time. But it just took me a while to fully realize that and understand how I wanted to apply that or align my life with that.
Yeah. And what a tragedy of this country that, because you would have been a great teacher, right? And what a tragedy that we can't pay people enough to get everybody in there who really wants to do it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a topic for another podcast. What did you want to talk about today?
So yeah, I mean, I think along this same vein, I think just alignment was the topic I wanted to talk about, and just the importance of alignment. And I think in our careers, but our lives as well. I think there's a big gap. I think in terms of who people are and how their careers and or lives are aligned with those things. And I think there's a lack of awareness, I think, around that. And at least for me, that was a lack of awareness for a long time where I felt the misalignment, but I wasn't quite sure how to name it.
Hmm.
And so that's something I wanted to kind of maybe discuss a bit more
Yeah, I
with you
love
today.
it. I think that's so juicy and so relatable. And also, just from your retelling of it, I think you were a lot more aware of it than you probably even thought you were, even though you said you didn't really have a way to name it. But it sounds like along the way you're like, this isn't quite it. Let me shift. Oh, this isn't quite it either. Let me shift. And I suspect people can have their entire career and maybe hear that way far away, but never actually face that.
Yeah.
So what do you think it takes to really listen to that little voice of this is not quite right?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I mean, I think like looking back for me, I think you're spot on. That voice was always there, and I felt it, but I just didn't have the language for it. But I think knowing what I know now, what I would say is that over time I've learned that our feelings are they're messengers for us, right? And so they tell us when something's off or when something's going great or when something's not going great for us. And so I think that feeling that I had, that inner nagging, was like an indicator that something wasn't quite right. Maybe that it was a need that was being unmet, or but it was an invitation to explore a bit more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so that was the first thing, is just that being aware of that signal, right? When you start to feel something's off, trusting that, right? Because our feelings are messengers. And then I think the second thing I was missing was a framework. I didn't really have a great framework for, let's say that back then I had listened to the feeling, which I tried. I didn't have a great framework for making sense of it. And so I think, the framework of alignment is one that I think is very helpful for me. And I think could be helpful for others as well. It's been helpful for a lot of my clients so far. And that's just around understanding that, hey, there's a lot of different ways that our career and or life can align. And so just being aware of that and getting curious around, like, hey, if I'm feeling something is a bit off, maybe checking in with a framework of some sort that can help you identify or drill down and understand like what that might be. So for me, one of the ones that I've come up with is just, or I've learned over time, I shouldn't say I didn't create it myself, but it's just, being aware that, hey, a lot of times when it comes to career, there's a few different areas that can be misaligned. I think values is a big one, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes the way that shows up is if your work does not feel meaningful, or you're struggling to find a sense of purpose in your work. That can indicate that there's a misalignment in your values. I think another one is how motivated you are or energized by the work that you're doing. I think, feeling like you're not energized or not motivated is usually a sign of misalignment with your motivators, your internal motivators or your intrinsic motivators. I think for me, another big one was just in certain roles, it was a lack of interest in the work itself. And so I think that was a bit more centered around like, hey, okay, this is an interest misalignment. And then the last one, there's a couple others, but the last big one that I tend to see pretty often is around just personality fit, right? Like maybe you're in the wrong culture, or you're not, in an organization or a role that allows you to work in the ways that bring the best of you out. And so I think, starting with understanding, okay, there's a few different types of misalignment. So if I'm feeling some type of way, maybe I can start there, use that as an assessment tool or a diagnostic tool, understand what it's telling me, and then kind of go from there. Looking back on my career, I think, or my life, those are the two things I think were missing, was just that understanding of what the feeling was telling me deeply, and then like a framework of sorts to make sense of it.
Yeah, I wish I had talked to you 20 years ago. I remember I spent some time in a finance role, or in a whole, production finance field. And the whole time I was like, this isn't quite it. But so there must be something wrong with me, right? I think that's where
Mhm.
people can go with it. Oh, if I just work on myself or get better at it. Like by the time I got better at it, I felt more okay about being in that job. But people who are not me, outside of me, would always say like, "Why are you in this role?" Like, yeah,
Yeah.
you can do it, but the rest of you is not what this role is. And I would be just like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, but I that would have been really helpful to be able to look at it that way. When you when you told me this is what you wanted to talk about, and that using the values framework, I had a client I was working with, and we were doing a values exercise. And his first question was, well, is this work values or personal values? And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. Let's do both. And so he did both, and then found out there was zero overlap between the job values and the personal values. And that was such an aha moment of, oh, can I have some overlap in my values with the work that I'm doing? So now that's the work we're doing of what might that look like and what kind of possibilities are created if you allow the possibility that you can have your personal values also in your job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're describing. I think there's probably a lot of people out there that are feeling that same or dealing with that, and just haven't been able to name that so far. But I think that comes up a lot because we live in a society where we aren't really taught to pursue alignment in our careers, right? We're taught to pursue prestige or salaries or,
It's a key,
certain type security, certain
especially
titles,
right now.
etc. Yeah, especially right now, right? And there's nothing wrong with those things, but I think there's if there's a values misalignment, or our core values are not being met, then I think that's where that sense of emptiness kind of comes from, because you don't having work that's not aligned with who you are and your core values tends to leave you feeling like, hey, this is not, I don't see the meaning. I'm unable to find meaning or purpose in my work. And so I think in the work that I do with clients, values is the where we usually start. It's like getting really, really clear on what your values are, and then understand, because everything else kind of stems from there. And usually values are the thing that we use to make decisions, right? And for example, if a client's choosing between two particular career paths, right, we'll use values as kind of the criteria to assess the two, or to decide between the two, just because values tends to drive everything else pretty significantly. But yeah, I think that values misalignment is one that is probably present in most, if not all, the clients that I've dealt with, or that I've had the pleasure of working with. And I suspect that there's a lot more, there's many, many more people out there that are suffering from something similar.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And also, it comes to mind like, you remember, do what you love and the money will follow. And then we had a
Yeah.
generation of, oh, that's not true. That's not
Yeah.
always true.
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
how do you reconcile? How do you pull it apart? So it's not like, oh, do what you love, the money will follow. Well, I love to watercolor paint. That, I know for sure for me, that would not help me to earn a living and put a roof over my head. So how do you look at that kind of differently?
Yeah, so I think great question. And I tend to look at it, I tend to break down a few categories and look at alignment across those categories. So there's values, I look at motivators, I look at interests, and I look at, kind of personality fit. And I think like what you're describing, I think around, oh, I like to paint, that might fall a bit more into an interest category versus a core value, potentially, depending on, the person. So, but I think the way that I tend to think about it is values is kind of and motivators are the driver, right? So they kind of tell you what you'll find meaningful and what work will get you out of bed every day, like what activities will get you out of bed and motivated and energized. And then I think I look at interest as like the things that you point that energy towards. And so I find meaning in this work, or, in certain types of work based on my values. I'm motivated in certain types of work based on my motivators or my intrinsic motivators. And then I look at my interest to understand where I want to direct that energy towards, right? And then I tend to look at personality, because that kind of gives us a bit of a sense of like, okay, now that I know where I want to, direct my energy and my sense of meaning, this is the context that I need to do that within, in order for the best version of myself to show up.
Like, do you have
Right.
the
So that
personality for sales?
right, yeah, right. You may or may not. So yeah, like personality for sales, or it's like, hey, do you need to be in a more of a collaborative culture, or are you in kind of more of a, you know, more of an iBanking or consulting type culture? Neither is right or wrong, but it's important to know that about yourself, because a misalignment there, will likely end up in you not showing up as the best version of yourself and potentially being miserable, right? And so I tend to look at it with my clients around those four dimensions. That's where I tend to start off. And when we look for alignment, we tend to think about it like that. And there's a couple other dimensions. I think like strengths is another one, but that tends to kind of, at least in the work that I do with clients, tends to kind of work itself out when we look at the other assessments around value, interest, motivators, and personality.
Mm-hmm. How do you use this framework? I'm just thinking like in right now, when everyone's getting laid off,
Mhm.
and if you
Yeah.
have a job, you're not about to quit it to go find something that feels better. So
Mhm.
there's how do you transition while you're still in a job, or start thinking about it? But also, I need to get a job by the end of next week, or I'm not gonna be able to feed my family. I can't think about any of this stuff, and that's a luxury I will do once I have my 3 month savings in the bank. Like, how do you kind
Yeah.
of think about it in this time?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Like these are really difficult and challenging times. And so you're right. I mean, I think not everybody's not going to be able to make that kind of a shift or pivot right away, right? Depending on their individual circumstances. And so the way that I think about it is, if a person is in need of making a move today, and they don't have the time or the financial luxury to put together a longer term plan, then I think, I look at it in two phases. The short term is just getting a job and doing what you need to do in order to kind of satisfy your needs in the short term. And I think to the extent that you can start to align that short term role or move with your values and your interests and motivators, great. If you could, to the extent that you can align them, great. But if you can't, because that's not always going to be possible, that's fine. I think you essentially, quote unquote, stop the bleeding, right? And then you start to look at the longer term around, like, okay, we got something in the short term, and so, like, the anxiety that I've been feeling, or the fear, or like the need to be able to put food on the table and provide for my family, I've gotten that taken care of. And now that I've kind of gotten things steady, I'm starting to look at the longer term, and starting to look at what that might look like in terms of moving toward a work that's a bit more aligned.
Can we dig deeper into your framework? Like we talked about values, talk about
Yeah.
motivators.
Yeah. So our motivators are things that, intrinsically energize us. And so I'm trying to think of a few that might, let's say that maybe you're motivated by affiliation, meaning you're motivated and energized by being, a part of a group or a community or an organization that, you know, matches your values or your interests, for example. Or maybe it's around, maybe you're motivated by altruism, and so you want to do work that's service oriented. I'm trying to think of another good one. Financial security is often a motivator, a pretty strong motivator for people. But these are things that, when they're present in a role, they tend to give you the energy that you need in order to do, to show up every day and perform the role to the best of your abilities. And I think over the long term, when you think about a career, I think your motivators are the things that give you that sustainable energy to be able to, kind of stay with it long term. It's going to energize you to, you know, to do, to learn and to grow and to develop in the role, right? So it's kind of your competitive advantage, because it gives you the energy to continue to push through the highs and the lows, right? Because a lot of people, you can fake it for a while, potentially, depending on the role you are in. A lot of people can, and how you're wired, right? Depending on how you're wired, you might be able to compartmentalize. But over time, it does cost you. And I think, it might cost you with, like, maybe it puts you in a bad mood, right? And so you're spending all this energy to, to do what's required at work. So that when you get home, you're not the most pleasant to be around for your spouse or for your kids, right?
Then
Or
your
it might
life
take
also sucks, not just your
yeah,
job.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It takes its toll in different ways. But I think when you are aligned with it from a motivator standpoint, then that tends to be quite the competitive advantage, because it does allow you. It's kind of like that. It's what you need to sustain yourself over the long run. And so it's the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning and say, okay, I'm energized to go do this. And it's slightly different than interest, but
Hmm.
they're related, but they are somewhat different.
Like
But
I'm
that's how
thinking
I look
about
at
it.
motivators.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking about it as motivator is I want to help people. I want to help make other people's jobs easier. Might be a motivator, not
Yeah.
typically an interest, but tell me how the interests would be different.
Yeah. So I think the motivators are the things that, like, energize you. And your interests, I think, the way I would think about those are, it's more like the content or the topics that you're actually interested in. And these are the things, I think, when you're interested in something, that tends to align pretty closely with, like, a state of flow. And so when you're interested in a topic and you get, you can be, you fully immerse yourself, and you can, you enter a state of flow, and next thing you know, you look up and you've been doing this thing that you're so interested in for 4 hours, and you're like, where did the time go? Right.
Yeah.
It's not so much that it's energizing you as much as it's capturing your full attention.
Yeah.
Right. And it's allowing you to be fully present in that moment because you're interested and so, like, engulfed in the topic or you know,
Okay, I have an example. And then I'm going to ask you for a
okay.
bunch of examples on these. I had a client once who was in my former role that had production finance, which is
Mhm.
hiring accountants and overseeing all the financials on film and television. But you could
Okay.
use that skill in any industry, right? Overseeing
Mhm.
accounting. And we went through this exercise of what are all the things that matter for you in this job and what are all the skills. And then the question I asked was, okay, but what if this had nothing to do with film and television and you were manufacturing
Mhm.
something? And the answer
Yeah.
was, God, no, I'm not going to do that. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, now we have
Yeah.
information about what direction we need to go in, because it was such a clear, I am not interested in anything involving accounting in any other industry. And so I was
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
then you can focus on where you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me some
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a client that I was working with recently that was really, really, was in a role that was it had some alignment, but then there were a few areas that were misaligned, mostly around personality and then around, I guess, motivators would be the second piece, right? And so that's one of the things that we had uncovered through our work together is because the client had mentioned just she didn't really feel all that energized, getting out of bed every day and kind of forcing herself to do the activities that she was doing were difficult for her because she just wasn't motivated by that type of work. And then the environment that she was doing the work in was difficult for her, right? She was a part of a company culture that was very different than how she was wired and what her personality suggests that, would be a good fit for her. And so by coming up with identifying what was driving those feelings of misalignment or like that feeling of restlessness that she felt, we were then able to kind of craft a strategy for her to make a pivot towards work that would be a bit more energizing and that would be a better fit for her personality. And so what we started to look at was like, okay, this particular person happened to be pretty motivated by altruism, I guess, like helping service oriented work. And they also tended to be very, in terms of personality, that they needed a culture that was a bit more flexible, a bit more autonomous, but also very, less formal, a bit more collaborative. And so taking those two pieces, we were able to understand, okay, when we're looking for a new role, we need to find you one that is going to allow you to center the work around service, right? So being able to help people, and for her specifically, it was around human development. And so we need to find a role that's going to allow you to work in that human development space where you can either coach or mentor or develop others. And you need to be able to do so in a context that is a company culture that's a bit more collaborative, but also gives you, she needed clear direction, but the flexibility and the autonomy to achieve those broader objectives however she saw fit. And so in that example, we were able to kind of identify some good organizations that were a good fit. And then we were able to also use that information to kind of help her craft her strategy for how she would present herself and market herself. So how she would, you know, set up her cover letter, what specifically she would highlight and speak to in her resume, even her networking strategy, right? Because we needed one that felt a bit more authentic and relational versus transactional for her, right? And so given that, we needed to be very intentional about the ways that we did the networking and reached out to others. And so, you know, I think just that clarity, it did a few things for her. The first thing it did was it kind of helped to ease some of the initial tension that she had because she came in feeling restless and she was like, I'm not sure what to do with this. And she didn't quite know how to like frame the what she was feeling. But I think using this framework, we were able to identify, kind of narrow in and hone in on what specifically was driving the misalignment, and then find roles that avoided the things that were misaligned previously and actually would it would become an advantage for her, right? So moving into roles that motivated her intrinsically and provided the type of culture and working context that would bring out the best version of herself. We were able to kind of come up with a pretty good strategy that left her feeling pretty good about the work that she was going to move into.
I love
Is
how
that
it's so
helpful?
simple, but so informative. Like the framework can help diagnose your current situation, but then also
Hmm.
informs finding your new role. And I loved how you talk about also what kind of job you look for, how you present yourself, how you talk about it, how you write about yourself in your resume, how it informs
Hmm.
all of that so that you have a much better chance going forward of getting something that feels right to you.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
Do you need to have all of these aligned in order to feel aligned? Or are any of them more important than others?
Yeah, so you don't need to have them all. I mean, I think in an ideal world, if you can get them all as aligned as possible, like I think the more you can do that, I think the better you'll feel. But everybody's a little different, and so it just depends on your tolerance, right? So, for example, some people have a higher tolerance for doing work that is not as aligned on the interest spectrum than others, right? But I think in terms of the importance, how I would look at them is I think the values and the motivators are the two most important, right? Because they tell you what's meaningful and they tell you what's going to get you out of bed and actually energize you and give you that like sustained energy to do the work. I think interests and personality are equally important or also important, but I think values and motivators are the two that I tend to start with because I think they tend to determine you know the sustainability, I should say, of work over the long run.
Okay, so let me make sure I have these. Values, motivators, interests, personality. Did I miss anything?
Mhm. No,
Okay.
I mean there's strengths, but that's not part of my framework because it tends to kind of come out on its own usually
Yeah.
through the other assessments we do.
I,
But yeah,
I
yeah,
love
you
it.
captured it well.
Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you about this?
I did want to touch on something you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
which was around, I think one of the things you mentioned earlier is that people often will, when they are in a role and it's not a good fit for them, they'll tend to internalize it as being about them or being some kind of a personal failure. And I've seen that a lot. And it resonates with me because I've definitely felt that way myself when I was in misaligned roles. But the one thing that I've noticed in doing this work is that it's very rarely about the person, right? It's just simply a misalignment. It's just you're in the wrong environment, or you're not you're doing work essentially that goes against how you're naturally wired, and that's not in like a failure on your part or on the organization's part. It's just simply a misalignment. And so I think that's probably one of the things that I talk about with my clients a lot is being able to kind of shift this from being about them to it being about the fit or about the alignment. Because I think people can be pretty hard on themselves, and when you are making it about yourself, it can actually make it more difficult in the future to move into different roles because now you're not only are you battling the misalignment, but you're also battling like your own internal, like your inner critic, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think shouldn't be understated. It's like, hey, this misalignment doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means there's something wrong with the fit or the alignment.
Yeah.
And that's a very different thing than,
That
something, being wrong with you.
that's huge. That's huge to be able to put that into context and take it out of it's not necessarily about you. Also, you don't have to villainize the place where you are because
Yeah.
they also may not be terrible. I mean, they may be terrible, but that they may not be terrible. You know what I mean? They may not be
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
villain.
Exactly.
And so you don't have to
Yeah.
make the story where they're the villain and you're the victim and what is going on here. And really,
Yeah.
it's no harm, no foul. It's misalignment. Let's free
Yeah.
everybody to move on.
Exactly. And the sooner you can recognize and act on that, I think the sooner you can remove yourself from a misaligned situation and intentionally pursue a situation where you are aligned. And honestly, like, I deal with this in the career context, but I think the more I kind of look at this framework and just think about it in the broader context of life, I think it applies in a lot of areas, not just career.
And more.
I think when it comes to choosing a partner, right? I think alignment is really, really big. And I think we aren't taught typically as a society to look for those, or at least to look for values alignment per se, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that probably contributes to a lot of friction that you see in relationships, not just marriage, but like any kind of relationship, right? I think an alignment in terms of even coming down to where you live, right? I mean, I think you can be aligned with
I'm living this
a city or
viscerally
a
right now.
state. Or, like you could be aligned with like a societal or societal values, or not aligned with societal values, and you'll feel that disalignment, much like you'll feel it when you're misaligned in your relationships or you're misaligned in your career. So the more that I become aware of alignment and the impacts it has on us and how it shows up internally or just within us in terms of feelings or sensations that we might have, right? Like a pit in our stomach, or like a frog in our throat, as they say. I
Or
think all these
imposter
things
syndrome.
or imposter syndrome, right?
Again, might not be you.
Might not be you,
That
exactly. So
probably is not you. Let me say that.
yeah, I think most of the time it's yeah, it's not you. It's the you're just in the wrong environment, right?
And I'm thinking about this
Um,
also from the perspective of if you're a leader and you have someone
mhm.
who is it's just not the right role for them. Like you can
Exactly.
have a very candid conversation about that in a way that is not blaming and does not you suck. Is you can put a very different perspective on this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that, understanding that, the role that alignment or misalignment plays can actually allow a person to be a lot more empathetic towards others, right? I mean, sometimes, to your point, oftentimes if there's a misalignment, somebody gets villainized. Usually it's both parties are villainizing the other party, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, that may not be the case. And so I think that just being aware of the alignment, I think, and just like the role that it plays, I think gives us a framework from which to find the right fit and ensure that we are putting ourselves in the positions to, for the best version of ourselves to come out. Like I said, whether that's career, relationships, where you live, etc.
All the things.
All the things, yeah.
Thank you, Ron. I am learning a lot today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on my website at www.thealteracollective.com.
You spell it.
Yeah, TheAlteraCollective.com.
Okay. And we'll link to it in the
And
show notes. And are you on LinkedIn as well?
yeah, I am. And you can find me at Ron Pratt Altera, all one word, on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, Ron, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Julie. I appreciate it. And I enjoyed spending this half hour chatting with you.
Me too. Okay, bye.
All right, bye-bye.
This has been Deep Work Out Loud. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. I'd like to thank Ron Pratt for joining the podcast. If any of this resonates with you, please subscribe and leave a review at all the podcast places. And if you'd like to work with me, you can find me at julieharrisoliver.com. And let me leave you with this. How aligned are you in your current job? And what would it look like if you start to take a look at those different aspects? Your values, your motivations, your interests, and your personality. Think about it. Report back. Thanks for listening. See you next time.